December 14th, 1931. Woodley Airfield, Reading, England. A 21-year-old RAF pilot named Douglas Bader is standing beside his Bristol Bulldog fighter. Someone in the group has made a remark, a challenge, the casual, competitive kind that young men who fly fast aircraft make to each other without fully thinking through the consequences. Bader accepts it. He climbs in, taxis to the runway, takes off, and begins a low-level aerobatic sequence. Rolling, turning, the wingtip 6 feet from the ground, then 4, then 2. Then the wingtip touches the ground. The aircraft cartwheels across the field. By the time it stops, Douglas Bader is unconscious and bleeding from wounds that will take the surgeons hours to assess and a lifetime to understand. When he wakes up, both legs are gone, one amputated above the knee, one below. His logbook entry, written later, reads, "Crashed slow rolling near ground. Bad show." That is the entirety of his commentary on the event that should have ended everything. His career, his independence, his future as the man he had planned to be. Bad show. Move on. 13 years later, on June 8, 1945, Group Captain Douglas Bader climbed into a Spitfire at the head of a formation of 300 aircraft and led the Victory flypast over London. Below him, millions of people looked up. He flew on 2 prosthetic legs, the same prosthetic legs the German Air Force had tried to steal from him. The same prosthetic legs the RAF had twice told him disqualified him from flying. The same legs that had become the most famous legs in the history of British aviation. This is the story of what happened between the crash and the flypast. It is the most complete story of refusal that the Second World War produced. Douglas Robert Stewart Bader was born on February 21st, 1910, in St. John's Wood, London. His father was a civil servant who had served as a sapper, a military engineer, in the First World War, and came home from France wounded. He died of those wounds when Douglas was 7 years old. The wound that killed his father was one of the 10 million ways the First World War found to destroy the generation that fought it. For Douglas Bader, growing up in its aftermath meant growing up with an absence at the center of things. A father who had gone to France and not come back whole, and then not come back at all. His mother and stepfather had limited patience for the raising of an energetic, competitive, physically gifted boy who had strong opinions about everything and the athletic ability to back most of them up. He was sent to St. Edward's School in Oxford, a boarding school that would, in a few years, also educate Guy Gibson, who would go on to lead the Dam Busters raid. The school produced men who were capable and driven, and not particularly inclined to accept limitations on what they thought they could do. Bader fit the mold completely. He was an outstanding sportsman in the specific, total way that some men are. Not good at one thing, but genuinely excellent at several. Rugby. He was close to national selection level, a physical, aggressive player who treated every match as a tactical problem to be solved through superior preparation and willingness to take punishment. Cricket. First-class standard. Boxing. He moved through physical challenge the way other men move through conversation. Naturally, hungrily, always looking for the next thing to test himself against. He joined the Royal Air Force in 1928. He was commissioned in 1930. He was nearly expelled from the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell for accumulating too many late nights and too many minor infractions. The persistent friction of a man who was extremely good at the central thing the institution existed to produce, and somewhat indifferent to the peripheral requirements it also enforced. He graduated. He went to 23 Squadron at Kenley. He flew Bristol Bulldogs, the RAF's frontline biplane fighter, a sweet-handling aircraft that rewarded aggressive pilots and punished complacent ones. Bader was not complacent about anything. The culture of 23 Squadron in 1931 was the culture of an RAF that still carried the flavor of the First World War's aerial romanticism. The idea that flying was adventure, that skill was the currency that mattered, that the boundaries between what was authorized and what was merely possible were suggestions rather than rules. On December 14, 1931, that culture produced a dare. Bader accepted it. The aerobatic sequence he attempted, low-level slow rolls, the wingtips skating along the ground at speed, was the kind of maneuver that looks spectacular when it works and catastrophic when it doesn't. The margin for error at that altitude was measured in inches. Bader ran out of inches. The surgeons who worked on him through the night of December 14th and into the morning of December 15th did what they could. They amputated his right leg above the knee and his left leg below it. The right leg came off quickly. The damage was too severe to attempt saving it. The left leg they tried to save. They failed. He was 21 years old. He had been flying operationally for 18 months. His career, by any conventional assessment, was over. He was unconscious for most of the first week. When he came back to something like awareness, the reality assembled itself in pieces. The hospital ceiling, the pain, the heaviness where his legs should have been, the nurses moving carefully around a truth they hadn't yet been asked to deliver directly. He asked directly. They told him. What happened next, in the weeks of recovery, in the grinding work of learning what his body could still do and what it could no longer do, is not documented in the dramatic, turning-point language that biographical accounts tend to reach for. It was slower than that, messier. There were days that were bad and days that were worse, and eventually days that were merely difficult. And in the accumulation of those days, Bader began to understand the new parameters of his existence. He learned to walk on prosthetic legs, not shuffle, walk, with a gait that, to people who didn't know, read as a slight swagger rather than the mechanical compensation it actually was. He learned to drive a modified car. He played golf. He danced, badly at first, then adequately, because adequately was not what he aimed for, and he kept practicing until the prosthetics responded the way he needed them to. He applied to return to flying. The RAF said no. He appealed. He demonstrated. He got into a plane and showed them what he could do. The medical board reviewed the demonstration and said no again, not because of what he had shown them, but because the regulations did not contain a framework for a pilot with no legs, and institutions without frameworks default to refusal. He found a desk job at the Asiatic Petroleum Company. He pushed paper. He drove his modified car. He played golf. He watched the world from the ground and felt the absence of the air in the specific, physical way that people who are built for one thing feel its absence when it is taken from them. Then, in 1939, his sister-in-law said something that explained everything about Douglas Bader's relationship with the war that was coming. She said he was the only person in their household who was absolutely longing for war to come. He had said, "They'll have to have me now." He was right. When the war began in September 1939, Douglas Bader went back to the RAF and asked again. This time the answer was different. The RAF that had turned him away in peacetime, that had pointed to its regulations and its medical boards, and its institutional inability to accommodate a pilot without legs, was now an RAF that was going to need every trained, experienced, aggressive pilot it could find. The mathematics of the coming air war did not leave room for turning away men who could fly. He was accepted. He was assigned to 19 Squadron at Duxford, flying Spitfires. Here is the detail about Douglas Bader that most accounts mention briefly and then move past, but that deserves to be examined properly. His missing legs were not a disadvantage in air combat. They were, in a specific and counterintuitive way, an advantage. The primary physical threat to a fighter pilot in high-speed combat is G-force, the centrifugal force generated by tight turns and rapid maneuvers that pushes blood away from the brain and toward the lower body. When blood drains from the brain, the pilot's vision narrows, dims, and eventually goes black. At high enough G-forces, the pilot loses consciousness entirely, a condition called G-lock, and a condition that ends air combat careers and sometimes lives. The human body's lower extremities, the legs, the abdomen, act as a reservoir for this blood pooling. The more lower body mass a pilot has, the more blood drains away from the brain under G-force. Bader had no legs. The blood that would have pooled in the legs of other pilots had nowhere to go. He could sustain tighter turns, higher G-forces, longer combat maneuvers before his vision degraded. In the specific physical grammar of aerial dogfighting, the crash that took his legs had also, accidentally, grotesquely, undeniably, given him an edge that no other RAF pilot possessed. He led 242 Squadron from June 1940, taking command of a unit that had been badly mauled in France and needed rebuilding. He rebuilt it through the combination of technical instruction, tactical creativity, and the specific leadership quality of a man who had already faced the worst thing that could happen to him and decided it wasn't going to stop him. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940. Bader flew through it with the focused aggression of a man who had spent 8 years on the ground, waiting to be here. He developed and advocated for the big wing concept, the controversial tactical doctrine that argued RAF squadrons should mass together before engaging German formations, rather than scrambling individually. The debate about whether the big wing was tactically sound consumed significant RAF command attention during the Battle of Britain, and remains contested by historians. What is not contested is what Bader did in the air. He flew constantly. He engaged wherever he found the enemy. He led from the front in the specific physical sense, not directing from a command post, but in the first aircraft, taking the first shot, staying in the fight until the fuel ran out. By August 1941, he had claimed 22 German aircraft destroyed, the 5th highest total in the entire RAF, achieved in approximately 14 months of combat flying on 2 prosthetic legs by a man the RAF had twice told was unfit to fly. Then, on August 9, 1941, something happened over France that nobody has ever fully explained. Bader's Spitfire went down over Saint-Omer in occupied northern France. Whether he was hit by German fire or caught in the debris of a German aircraft he had just shot down is still disputed. Bader himself was never certain. What is certain is that he found himself in a spinning, disintegrating Spitfire at altitude, with the canopy jammed and the aircraft coming apart around him. He tried to bail out. His prosthetic right leg, the one attached above the knee, became trapped in the cockpit as the aircraft twisted. He was half out of the plane, the wind tearing at him, the ground below getting closer, the leg stuck. The retaining strap holding the prosthetic to his harness snapped. The leg stayed in the plane. Bader fell free. He pulled his parachute. He landed unconscious in a French field, captured almost immediately by German soldiers, who looked at the man on the ground. No legs, 1 prosthetic remaining, metal ribbons on his uniform, and understood that they had found someone significant. They took him to the Luftwaffe base at Saint-Omer. There, he met Adolf Galland. Galland was one of Germany's greatest fighter pilots, decorated, experienced, the commander of a Jagdgeschwader on the Channel coast. He was also, beneath the uniform and the war, an aviator who recognized another aviator. He invited Bader to sit in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109. He treated him with the specific respect that exists between men who share a discipline, regardless of which side of a war they are on. Bader's prosthetic leg had been lost in the crash. Galland went to Goering. Goering approved a request, one of the stranger moments in the entire air war, to allow an RAF aircraft to fly over occupied France and drop a replacement prosthetic leg by parachute to the Luftwaffe base at Saint-Omer. The operation was approved. The RAF flew the mission. The leg was dropped. The Germans called it Operation Leg. Bader received the new prosthetic, thanked Galland for his hospitality, reattached the leg, and immediately began planning his escape. He tried to get out through a window using knotted bed sheets. He almost made it. The Germans caught him in the street. He tried again. They caught him again. At this point, the German command made a decision that was, in its own way, a tribute to what Bader represented. They began confiscating one of his prosthetic legs at night and returning it in the morning. A man with one prosthetic leg and no other legs could not walk well enough to escape. The Germans were stealing his legs to keep him in prison. His response to this, the goon baiting, as POWs called the systematic harassment and mockery of guards, became so relentless, so creative, and so effective at degrading camp discipline that the German command made a second decision. They sent him to Colditz. Colditz Castle, Oflag 4C, was Germany's answer to the prisoner of war problem that wouldn't stay solved. It sat on a rocky promontory above the town of Colditz in Saxony, a medieval fortress that the German military had converted into a maximum security prison for Allied officers who had escaped from other camps or who were considered high-risk escape threats. The logic was elegant and brutal. Take everyone who was causing the most trouble elsewhere and put them in one place that was genuinely difficult to escape from. The flaw in the logic was that it also concentrated in one place every creative, determined, technically capable officer in the Allied prisoner population. Colditz became the most escape-focused institution in the history of captivity. Its inmates included officers who had escaped from other camps multiple times, engineers who could fabricate anything from available materials, linguists who spoke fluent German, and men who had decided that escape was not a hobby, but a duty. Douglas Bader arrived and immediately felt at home. He could not escape from Colditz himself. The physical demands of moving through the castle's tunnels and over its walls required leg capabilities he did not have. But he could contribute to the escape efforts of others, and more importantly, he could continue the campaign of systematic psychological harassment of the German guards that had gotten him sent there in the first place. The goon baiting at Colditz was an art form practiced by men with too much time, too much intelligence, and too much invested in making their captors' lives difficult. It ranged from the minor, deliberate mispronunciation of German commands, theatrical incomprehension of obvious instructions, to the operationally significant, as guard routines were mapped and exploited, and the information fed into escape planning. Bader was a gifted practitioner. He was also still flying, in the only way available to him. He gathered intelligence from new arrivals about what was happening in the air war outside. He analyzed it. He discussed tactics with other pilots in the camp. He maintained the mental and intellectual engagement with aerial combat that kept him oriented toward the day when the war would end and the sky would be available again. The war did end. On May 15, 1945, American forces liberated Colditz. Douglas Bader walked out of the castle on 2 prosthetic legs, the same legs, more or less, that the Germans had been confiscating every night. made his way back to England, back to the RAF, back to the air. There is a post-war moment involving Bader and Galland that belongs in this story because it completes something the war had started. At a reunion of Luftwaffe pilots in Munich after the war, Bader walked in. He looked around the room at the German pilots who had fought against him, the men of the Jagdgeschwader and the Luftflotten, who had spent 5 years trying to shoot him down and largely failed. He said, "My God, I had no idea we left so many of you bastards alive." The room, men who had every reason to resent the remark, laughed. Because Bader said it the way he said everything, directly, without malice, with the specific humor of a man who had been in the middle of it and survived, and could now look at the people who had been on the other side and recognize them as men who had also been in the middle of it and survived. The friendship with Galland continued for the rest of Bader's life. In 1945, Galland was seriously wounded in combat, shot through the knee, his leg damaged. Bader, learning of this, personally arranged for Galland to be fitted with a prosthetic. The man whose operation leg had sent a replacement prosthetic across the channel to a captured enemy in 1941 now received one in return, arranged by that same enemy. The symmetry is almost too neat for fiction. It happened anyway. Consider what Bader's presence in the air war actually meant beyond the personal story. 22 confirmed kills, the 5th highest total in the RAF, achieved by a man flying on prosthetic legs who had been told twice by the institution he was flying for that he was unfit to fly. The big wing controversy, the tactical debate that his advocacy generated during the Battle of Britain, forced the RAF to think seriously about formation tactics and engagement doctrine at a moment when getting those decisions right was genuinely consequential. Whether his specific approach was correct is still debated. That his thinking influenced the debate is not. And there is the harder to quantify contribution, what it meant to the men flying beside him to see Douglas Bader climb into a Spitfire every morning. He had no legs. He had been told he couldn't fly. He had spent 8 years on the ground refusing to accept that verdict. And now he was here, in the same sky, in the same fight, leading from the front. The RAF had a word for the particular quality that Bader embodied. They called it press on regardless. Bader had been pressing on regardless since December 14th, 1931. He hadn't stopped yet. On June 8th, 1945, Douglas Bader led 300 aircraft over London in the Victory Flypast. He flew at the head of the formation in a Spitfire over the city that had spent 5 years under German bombs, over the people who had spent 5 years looking up at the sky, hoping that the men up there were winning. They were. He was knighted in 1976. Not for shooting down 22 German aircraft, not for escaping from POW camps, not for leading the big wing or flying through the Battle of Britain, or any of the things that had made him famous during the war. He was knighted for his services to the disabled. After the war, Bader became one of the most prominent advocates in Britain for amputees and people with physical disabilities, visiting hospitals, speaking publicly, demonstrating through his existence that the limitations others placed on disabled people were their limitations, not the disabled person's. He had lived that argument for 40 years. He made it loudly for the rest of his life. He died on September 5th, 1982, of a heart attack in London. He was 72 years old. His final logbook total was 5,744 flying hours. Adolf Galland flew from California to attend the funeral. A man Bader had spent years trying to shoot down. A man whose Air Force had stolen his legs at night. A man whose friendship had been forged in one of the stranger gestures of the entire war. A replacement leg dropped by parachute into occupied France, flew across the world to say goodbye. 42 years of friendship started over a lost prosthetic leg in Saint-Omer in 1941. Here is the full measure of Douglas Bader, stripped to its essential terms. He crashed because of a dare at 21 and lost both legs. He learned to walk, drive, dance, and play golf on prosthetics. He applied to fly again and was refused twice. He waited 8 years for a war that would make his refusal inevitable. He flew on legs he wasn't supposed to have, using a physical disadvantage that had become a physical advantage, and became the 5th highest scoring ace in the RAF. He was shot down, escaped twice, had his legs stolen nightly, was sent to the most secure prison in Germany, and still managed to make his captors miserable enough to remember him forever. Then he spent the rest of his life telling disabled people that the word impossible was other people's problem, not theirs. Bad show. Press on regardless. That was Douglas Bader's whole philosophy, written in 2 sentences in a logbook on the night of December 14th, 1931. He spent the next 50 years proving it.